No, she will not return with you." The words were spoken so calmly that, for one strange heartbeat, nobody in the breakfast room moved. Lady Holly Ashford stood near the long window with one gloved hand resting on the back of a chair, her face pale, her mouth still bruised beneath the careful powder her maid had pressed there at dawn. Across from her, her husband stared as though he had not understood the language. Then the Duke of Blackthorn stepped between them. It was not a dramatic movement. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look angry, which made him far more terrifying. Lord Edwin Ashford, who had spent 2 years humiliating his wife behind closed doors and 3 mornings pretending before society that she was merely a fragile, difficult woman. Davor's short laugh meant to sound amused. "You presume rather a great deal in my household affairs, Your Grace." Blackthorn's gaze did not shift. "You mistake me. I do not presume. I conclude." The hunting breakfast had fallen into a hush so complete that the crackle of the fire seemed indecently loud. Silver lay untouched, coffee cooled in porcelain cups. A viscountess near the mantel lowered her eyes at once, as though she had just realized she was witnessing the beginning of a ruin. Holly said nothing. She had said very little for months. That silence had become her last defense in a world where any word might be turned against her. 3 days earlier, she had still been Lady Edwin Ashford in the common understanding of the ton. A quiet wife, disappointingly subdued, too delicate for gaiety, too withdrawn for admiration. No one had spoken aloud of the way her sleeves were always long, even in heated rooms, or the way she flinched when a man moved too quickly beside her. Society noticed everything and acknowledged nothing. But then the Duke of Blackthorn had arrived at Ashford Hall before dawn, uninvited and unannounced, with rain still on his coat and the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. Holly had first seen him from the upper landing. She had been standing in the half-light outside her chamber, one hand pressed to the cut hidden near her temple, listening for her husband below. Instead, she had heard the opening of the front doors and the clipped murmur of servants suddenly thrown into rigid order. Then she saw him. Tall, severe, dark as a winter omen in a charcoal riding coat, not handsome in the easy manner of favored men, but arresting in the way of something dangerous and coldly disciplined. His presence altered the very shape of the room. Footmen straightened, housemaids vanished, even Edwin's steward lost all trace of habitual smoothness. The Duke had removed his gloves slowly, as though time itself answered to him. When his eyes lifted, they found Holly at once. Not her gown, not her posture. Her, and then, with dreadful precision, his gaze dropped to the mark at her throat where her collar had shifted. It lasted only a second. Yet in that second, Holly understood two impossible things. He had seen it, and he knew precisely what it meant. She had lowered her chin at once and retreated before Edwin could appear, but the moment pursued her through the entire day like a hand at her back. By evening, the house was brittle with tension. Edwin had returned from his study half-drunk and simmering. He had demanded to know why Blackthorn had spent a quarter of an hour alone with the estate solicitor. He had demanded why the Duke had asked after tenant contracts, household expenditures, and the names of those servants dismissed in the last 2 years. He had demanded, at last, whether Holly had said anything to him. She had not answered quickly enough. That had been mistake enough. The blow had split the inside of her lip. She remembered the taste of iron, the sharp corner of the dressing table against her hip, and Edwin's voice close to her ear, low and poisonous. "You will not make me a fool before him." As though she were the author of his shame. As though shame had not long since made its home in every corridor of that house. The next morning she had washed the blood from her mouth in a porcelain basin until the water ran pink. She had pressed the cloth to her lip and watched her own hands tremble. Beyond the chamber door she heard Edwin moving about with the careless heaviness of a man who feared no consequence. But Ashford Hall no longer belonged entirely to him. Blackthorn remained. He was to lead the morning hunt. That announcement alone had electrified the house. Dukes did not lend themselves to country sport merely to flatter lesser men. Certainly not this Duke, not one whose name carried with it whispers of iron judgment, political reach, and a patience far more merciless than temper. By the time the hunting party assembled in the mist-veiled field beyond the east lawns, Holly understood that something had shifted. Edwin understood it too. He merely did not yet know how badly. At the head of the riders, beneath a pale and unforgiving sky, the Duke of Blackthorn turned his horse and looked directly at Lord Edwin Ashford. and smiled. It was a slight smile. Controlled. Cold. The sort a man wore only when Mercy had already left the room. The hounds had not yet been loosed when the first crack appeared. Mist clung low across the rolling field, silvering the hedgerows and dampening the sound of hooves. Gentlemen adjusted their gloves. Ladies on horseback whispered behind veils. It was meant to be a morning of sport-light laughter, measured rivalry, a display of refinement beneath open sky. Instead, tension coiled through the gathering like a drawn wire. Holly sat very still upon her mare. She had not wished to ride. Edwin had insisted. "You will attend," he had said, fastening the clasp at her throat himself, his fingers pressing just a shade too tightly against her skin. "You will not hide in your chamber like a scolded child while his grace observes my household. My household, never our." She had nodded, because refusal was not a thing she was permitted. Now the cold air burned her lungs, and the memory of last night's silence pressed heavier than the weight of her riding cloak. She kept her gaze lowered, careful not to draw attention, careful not to exist more than necessary. Yet she felt it, that awareness again. The Duke. At the front of the field, Blackthorn sat his horse with effortless command, one gloved hand resting lightly upon the reins. He did not fidget. He did not speak unnecessarily. Even the most confident riders seemed to measure themselves against him without quite realizing it. And then his gaze found her. Not lingering, not inappropriate. Simply, certain, as though he marked her presence the way a general marks terrain before a battle. Holly's fingers tightened against the saddle. She looked away at once. "Ready yourselves," called the master of the hunt, his voice bright with forced enthusiasm. A horn sounded. The hounds surged forward, and the world broke into motion. Hooves thundered across damp earth. Cloaks snapped in the wind. Riders leaned into the chase with the reckless delight expected of them. Laughter rose, sharp and artificial, as though everyone were determined to pretend that nothing beneath the surface had shifted. Holly followed because she must. Her mare moved well, obedient and steady, but the pace quickly became punishing. Branches whipped past. Mud splashed. The clean lines of aristocratic composure dissolved into breathless urgency. Ahead, Edwin rode hard, too hard. He glanced back once, his expression already edged with irritation, as though Holly's mere presence offended him. "Keep up," he barked when she did not immediately match his speed. She urged her mare forward. The ground dipped unexpectedly. A hidden rut. Soft earth beneath the surface. Her horse stumbled. A sharp gasp escaped her as her balance faltered. For one terrifying second, the world tilted the sky, the ground, the blur of motion, and she thought she would fall. But she did not. The reins jerked violently as she fought for control. Pain shot through her wrists. Her mare recovered, but the damage had been done. Laughter, not kind, not gentle. A cluster of riders behind her had seen. "Lady Ashford is unwell for the sport," one lady murmured, not softly enough. "Or perhaps unsuited," another replied. Holly straightened in the saddle, her face burning beneath the chill air. She said nothing. She always said nothing. Edwin slowed just enough to wheel his horse beside her, his expression tight with barely concealed fury. "You embarrass yourself," he muttered under his breath. "I did not fall," she said quietly. "A mistake." His jaw tightened. "You nearly did." The words struck sharper than any public laughter. Before she could answer, before she could retreat into silence once more, another rider drew alongside them. Effortless, unhurried, commanding without a single raised tone. "The Duke of Blackthorn, Lord Ashford," he said, his voice even. "Your wife rides well for a lady who was not meant to be forced into pace." The air changed. Edwin's grip on the reins stiffened. "My wife requires discipline, not indulgence." Blackthorn's gaze shifted at last, fully to Holly. It did not soften. But neither was it indifferent. It saw too much. "She requires neither," the Duke replied calmly. "She requires respect." No one spoke. Even the hounds seemed distant now, their cries swallowed by the weight of that single word. Respect. Edwin let out a short, incredulous breath. "You speak as though you know her." Blackthorn did not look away from Holly when he answered. "I know enough." Holly's heart stuttered. For a moment, just a moment, she felt something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. Not safety, not yet, but the dangerous beginning of it. And that was far more terrifying. Edwin's expression darkened, his pride pricked in full view of others now slowing to watch. "You overstep, Your Grace." At last, Blackthorn turned his head. Slowly, deliberately. "Do I?" The quiet challenge landed harder than any shout. Around them, riders pretended to adjust reins, to calm their mounts, to look anywhere but directly at the unfolding tension. But no one truly left. No one dared. Because this was no longer a hunt. This was judgment, and everyone knew it. Holly felt it too. Felt the fragile edge upon which everything now balanced. Because if the Duke continued, if he pushed further, there would be no returning to silence. And silence was the only thing that had ever kept her alive in this marriage. Her breath caught. Blackthorn's gaze flickered once more to her face. Not commanding, not demanding, waiting, as though for the first time. The choice might belong to her. Holly did not speak. The moment stretched thin, fragile, impossible. A single word from her could shift everything, or destroy it. Her gloved fingers tightened around the reins until the leather pressed painfully into her skin. She felt every eye upon her now, though none dared to stare openly. Society had a way of witnessing without acknowledging, of judging without intervening. It would do so again, unless she broke the pattern, unless she chose something different. But choice had never been hers, not when her father arranged the marriage, not when Edwin first learned how easily silence could be mistaken for obedience. Not when the doors closed and the house forgot to hear her. Blackthorn waited. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Men like him did not wait. They commanded. They decided. They took. Yet here he was, still, composed, watching her as though the next movement belonged entirely to her will. Edwin laughed, sharp and brittle. "Well," he said, his tone laced with mockery, "have you suddenly found your voice, Holly? By all means, enlighten us. Or will you continue your little performance of fragility?" The words struck, as they were meant to, a performance, as though the bruises were carefully crafted, as though her silence were strategy, not survival. Holly's breath trembled. For one terrible second, she felt herself retreating, folding inward, shrinking back into the familiar safety of quiet submission. Say nothing, endure, wait for it to pass. That had always been the way. But then, a memory rose, unbidden, not of pain, of something far more dangerous. The look in Blackthorn's eyes that morning at the staircase, not pity, never pity, recognition, as though he had seen her clearly in a world that refused to. Her lips parted, no sound came. Edwin's expression twisted with satisfaction. There it is, as expected, and he reached for her reins, too quickly, too roughly. The movement was small, so small that to an untrained eye it might have appeared nothing more than a husband correcting his wife's position. But Holly flinched. She could not help it. The reaction was instinct, carved into her bones, and Blackthorn saw. The Duke's hand moved before thought could restrain it, not to strike, not to seize, simply to intercept. His gloved fingers closed over the reins just below Edwin's grasp, halting the motion with quiet, absolute authority. No. The word was low. Final. Edwin froze. For the first time since the hunt began, perhaps for the first time in years, he hesitated. "Remove your hand," Blackthorn continued, his tone unchanged. "You forget yourself." Color rose sharply in Edwin's face. "You forget your place, Your Grace. This is my wife." Blackthorn's gaze did not waver. "And you mistake what that permits." The stillness around them deepened. A baron shifted in his saddle, then stilled again. A lady turned her face away, though her posture remained rigid with attention. Even the horses seemed to sense the fracture in the air, their movements restrained, uneasy. Edwin let out a breath that bordered on a snarl. "You will regret this interference." "On the contrary," Blackthorn said quietly, "I find I regret not arriving sooner." The words landed like a blow. Not loud, not dramatic, but devastating in their implication. Holly's heart lurched. Something inside her, something long buried beneath fear and resignation, stirred with a sharp, unfamiliar ache. Edwin heard it too. Of course he did. His pride could not allow otherwise. "You presume a great deal about matters that do not concern you. They concern me now." A pause. Then, more deliberately, "They have since yesterday morning." Holly's breath caught. Yesterday. The staircase. the moment his eyes had found hers. This had begun then, not here, not at the hunt, but in that single, silent exchange where nothing had been spoken and everything had been understood. Edwin followed the direction of Blackthorn's gaze. For the first time, truly looked at his wife, not as an inconvenience, not as a possession, but as something contested. And the realization struck him hard. "You dare," he said, his voice lowering, "to make this into a spectacle over a woman who cannot even speak for herself?" Holly's pulse thundered in her ears. "Cannot speak." The words pressed against her chest, against her throat, against everything she had swallowed for so long. Blackthorn did not answer at once. Instead, he turned to her again, and, in a voice only slightly softer than before, said, "Lady Ashford." Not Holly, not familiarity. Respect. A choice, once more, placed in her hands. "You need not remain silent." The world narrowed to that single sentence, to the impossible weight of it. Holly felt it fear clawing up her spine, tightening around her lungs. If she spoke, there would be no return, no quiet survival, no careful endurance. Everything would break. Everything would change. And yet, had anything worth keeping remained unbroken? Her lips trembled. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "I," she faltered. Edwin leaned closer, his presence suffocating, his warning unspoken but absolute. "Do not." Holly closed her eyes for the briefest second, then opened them, and looked not at her husband, but at the Duke, at the man who had seen, who had waited, who had not turned away. Her voice did not rise, it did not steady, but it existed. "He hurts me." Silence fell. Not the polite silence of society, not the careful silence of avoidance, but something heavier, something undeniable. Because once spoken, truth could not be returned to the shadows. Edwin went still. The world held its breath, and the Duke of Blackthorn, finally, moved. No one breathed, not a servant hidden beyond the hedgerow, not a lady behind her veil, not even the hounds now distant, their cries swallowed by the weight of what had just been spoken. "He hurts me." The words lingered in the air like a bell that could not be unrung. Edwin did not react at once. That was the most terrifying part. He simply stared at her, as though his mind refused to accept what his ears had heard. Then, slowly, something dark and volatile rose behind his eyes. "You foolish girl," he said at last, his voice low, dangerously controlled. "You have no understanding of the damage you invite." Holly's hands trembled, but she did not look away this time. For the first time in years, she did not lower her gaze. "I understand it well enough," she whispered. The truth had broken something inside her, but it had also steadied something else. Edwin's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something far colder. "You will retract it." "No." The single word seemed to echo louder than her confession. A murmur rippled through the gathered riders, quickly stifled, quickly buried, but it existed, and that alone was dangerous. Edwin's control slipped. His hand moved again, faster this time, not toward the reins, toward her. But he did not reach her. He never would, because Blackthorn was already there. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not strike. He simply stepped between them, one gloved hand catching Edwin's wrist mid-motion. Firm, unyielding. Enough. It was not a request. Edwin's breath came sharp. "Release me." Blackthorn did not. Instead, he held his gaze steady, merciless. "You forget yourself repeatedly, Lord Ashford. I find my patience diminishing. You have no authority here." The Duke's grip tightened, not painfully but undeniably. "I have every authority where cruelty is concerned." The words were spoken without heat, which made them far more dangerous. For a moment it seemed Edwin might struggle, might escalate, might make a spectacle so scandalous that it would stain every name present. But even he understood something now. This was no longer a private matter. Not with witnesses, not with him standing there. Edwin yanked his wrist free at last, stepping back with a sharp exhale. "You will regret this," he repeated. Though the conviction had thinned, Blackthorn did not answer him. He had already turned away, toward Holly. The shift was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. where his stance toward Edwin had been rigid, immovable. His presence beside her was measured, careful. "Are you injured?" he asked. The question was quiet enough that only she could truly hear it. Holly blinked. No one had asked her that. Not once, not even after. Her throat tightened. "I." She hesitated, the old instinct to dismiss, to minimize, to protect him still lingering like a ghost. "It is nothing." Blackthorn's gaze did not soften, but it sharpened. "Do not insult either of us." The words were not cruel. They were precise. And for the first time, Holly felt something shift fully into place. Not fear, not quite safety, but the undeniable sense that she was no longer alone in what had been done to her. Her breath steadied just slightly. "It will fade," she said more honestly. A pause. Then, softer. "It always does." Something flickered in the Duke's expression. Not anger. Not exactly. But something deeper. Something controlled with visible effort. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what concerns me." Behind them, Edwin let out a harsh laugh. "You speak as though you intend to carry her off, Your Grace. Shall I expect you to claim her next?" The words were meant to provoke, to humiliate, to twist the moment into something improper. Blackthorn turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "I intend," he said, calm and unwavering, "to ensure that she is not returned to harm." The statement fell like a verdict. Not dramatic, not shouted, but final. Edwin's expression hardened. "You overreach, do I?" Blackthorn's tone did not change. "Or do you simply find yourself unaccustomed to consequence?" A ripple of tension moved through the onlookers. Because that was the word that did not belong in men like Edwin's world. Consequence. Holly felt it settle into her chest. Strange, unfamiliar, dangerous. Because if there were consequences, then everything she had endured might finally matter. Edwin straightened in the saddle, drawing himself up with brittle dignity. "This is not concluded." "No," Blackthorn agreed, his gaze returning to Holly once more. "It is not." The meaning in his voice sent a quiet tremor through her. Not fear. Not entirely, but anticipation of something inevitable. Something approaching, and for the first time, she did not dread what might come next. Because whatever it was, it would not be silence. The ride back to Ashford Hall was no longer a matter of sport. It was procession, slow, measured, heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had taken place. No one spoke openly of it. Of course they did not. The Ton never addressed scandal while it still breathed before them. They waited. They whispered later, behind fans and closed carriage doors where reputations could be shaped without risk. But silence now was not ignorance. It was calculation. Holly rode at a controlled pace beside the Duke of Blackthorn, not by command, not by force, simply because when the party had turned back he had not moved away, and no one had dared to suggest that she should. Edwin rode ahead, too straight, too rigid, a man holding himself together by pride alone. Holly kept her gaze forward, though she felt everything. The weight of glances, the shift in distance, the absence of his shadow at her side. For the first time since her marriage, he was not beside her, and that absence was louder than any presence had ever been. "You should not return to his rooms." The Duke's voice broke the quiet between them. Holly did not startle this time. She had grown accustomed in the span of a single morning to the steady certainty of his presence. "That is not a choice I am given," she replied softly. "It is now." The words were simple, but they carried something dangerous. Authority, not over her, but for her. Holly's fingers tightened slightly on the reins. "You cannot remain here indefinitely, Your Grace. When you depart, I do not depart until matters are settled." Her breath caught. There was no boast in the statement, no arrogance, only fact, and something beneath it. A promise she did not yet understand. They reached the long gravel drive of Ashford Hall just as the clouds broke enough to let a thin, cold light spill across the estate. The manor stood as it always had, imposing, respectable, untouched by the truth it contained. How easily walls concealed cruelty. How eagerly society believed them. Servants hurried forward as the riders dismounted, their movements careful, their eyes lowered. But Holly noticed. Of course she did. The way they lingered just a second too long. The way they avoided looking at Edwin entirely. The way something unspoken had already begun to spread. Truth did not need to be shouted. It moved quietly, relentlessly. Inside, the breakfast room had been reset. Fresh tea, new arrangements, polished silver. As though the morning had not fractured the very foundation of the household, Holly stepped across the threshold and paused. Because Edwin stood there, waiting, the room emptied quickly. No one wished to witness what came next. No one except Blackthorn did not leave. He removed his gloves with deliberate calm, placing them upon the table as though this were any ordinary coal. As though tension did not coil through the room like a drawn blade, Edwin's eyes flicked between them. Cold, calculating. "You will excuse us, Your Grace," he said. "My wife and I have matters to discuss." Holly felt it instantly. That familiar tightening, that unspoken warning wrapped in politeness. The door would close. The tone would change. The consequences would return. But before she could move, Blackthorn spoke. No. Just that. No explanation. No apology. Edwin's jaw clenched. "You presume I prevent," the Duke corrected calmly. The words settled heavily. Edwin laughed once, though there was no humor in it. "You cannot stand in my home and dictate. I can," Blackthorn said, meeting his gaze without the slightest hesitation, "when your conduct invites it." Silence pressed in again. Holly's heart pounded. This was the edge. The moment where everything would either fracture completely or be forced into the open. Edwin's eyes shifted to her. Not furious, not yet, but something worse. Measured. "You have made a grave error," he said quietly. "Do you imagine this ends in your favor?" Holly swallowed. The old instinct rose, apologize, retreat, undo. But she could not. Not now. Not after the truth had been spoken aloud. Her voice was soft, but it did not break. "I imagine," she said, "that it ends." That was all. Yet it was everything. Edwin went still. And for the first time, not just anger, not just pride, but something closer to uncertainty flickered across his face, because he no longer understood her, and men like him feared what they could not control. Blackthorn did not look at Edwin. He looked at Holly, and in that steady, unwavering gaze, there was no doubt, no hesitation. Only the quiet certainty that whatever came next, he would not allow her to face it alone. The door closed, not loudly, but with a finality that seemed to seal the room and everyone within it into something far more serious than a private conversation. Holly stood near the center of the breakfast room, her hands clasped lightly before her, her pulse unsteady but no longer frantic. She could feel it now, how close everything was to breaking, not just her marriage, but the careful illusion that had protected Edwin for years. He did not speak at once. Instead, he moved slowly toward the table, pouring himself a measure of brandy left from the night before. The act was deliberate, controlled, a man reclaiming his composure before he chose his next move. "You have embarrassed me," he said at last, without looking at her. The words might have sounded almost calm if not for the sharp edge beneath them. Holly did not answer. Behind her, Blackthorn remained still, watching, waiting. Edwin turned then, glass in hand, his expression no longer volatile but coldly resolved. "You will correct it." Holly's fingers tightened together. "I will not." The refusal did not echo. It did not need to. Edwin's gaze shifted to her fully now, searching, measuring whether she truly meant it. "You mistake your position," he said quietly. "A wife does not accuse her husband without consequence." "A husband does not strike his wife without one," Blackthorn replied. Edwin's eyes snapped to him. "You will be silent." "I will not." The symmetry of the words hung between them like drawn steel. For a moment, the room felt smaller, more dangerous. Edwin exhaled sharply, setting the glass aside with controlled force. "This farce ends now." He stepped toward Holly, slowly, deliberately, as though he had decided something. "Apologize," he said, his voice lowering. "You will tell His Grace that you spoke in error, that you were overwrought, that you know." This time, the word came before fear could stop it. Holly did not step back, did not lower her gaze, and that That unsettled him more than any accusation. "You will regret this defiance," Edwin said, his tone tightening. "I already regret my silence." The truth struck harder than anything she had spoken before. It left no room for retreat, no space for denial. Edwin's composure fractured. Not completely, but enough. His hand moved, not to seize her, not this time, but to gesture sharply, dismissively, as though he would cast her words aside. Enough of this nonsense. The impact came from somewhere else, not a blow, a sound. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a document striking the table. Both of them turned. Blackthorn had moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but decisively. A folded paper now lay before Edwin, sealed once but broken. "You will read that," the Duke said. Edwin frowned, irritation flickering into suspicion. "What is this?" "Your accounts," Blackthorn replied evenly. "Your tenant records, and the sworn statement of a dismissed housemaid." The room stilled. Holly's breath caught. Edwin did not touch the paper at once, but something had shifted in his expression. Something wary. "You had no right." "I had every right," Blackthorn interrupted calmly. "When your conduct warranted inquiry." A pause. Then, "Shall I read it aloud?" The threat was quiet, devastating, because this was no longer about whispers, no longer about private cruelty hidden behind respectable doors. This was exposure. Edwin's hand closed over the document at last, snatching it from the table. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, then again, more slowly. The color drained from his face. For the first time, not anger, not pride, but something far more fragile appeared. Fear. Holly felt it, saw it, and understood. This was not only about her, not only about what he had done in silence. There were others, servants dismissed, voices silenced, truth buried beneath position and name. "You dare," Edwin said, though the words lacked their former force. Blackthorn stepped closer, measured, unyielding. "I do not dare," he said. "I conclude." The same words, the same calm certainty, but now, with evidence, with weight. "With this," he continued, his gaze fixed on Edwin, "I may proceed in any manner I find appropriate, publicly, if required." Holly's heart pounded, because she understood what that meant. Scandal, ruin, the complete dismantling of everything Edwin had built his name upon. Edwin understood it too. His grip on the paper tightened, crumpling its edge. "You would destroy a man's reputation over this?" he demanded. Blackthorn's expression did not change. "You destroyed your own." The silence that followed was absolute, because there was no defense left, no denial, no carefully constructed facade that could withstand what now stood plainly before them. Holly looked at her husband, and, for the first time, he did not look powerful. He looked cornered. Blackthorn's voice, when it came again, was quieter, but far more dangerous. "You will apologize." A pause, then. "You will beg her forgiveness." The words settled like a sentence already passed, and for the first time in years, Holly realized the end had already begun. The room did not move. Time itself seemed to pause, held between what had been and what could no longer be undone. "You will apologize." The words still lingered. "You will beg her forgiveness." Edwin Ashford stood frozen, the crumpled document trembling faintly in his hand. The man who had ruled his household with quiet cruelty, who had never once been questioned, never once been challenged, now faced something he had never prepared for. Consequence. "This is absurd," he said, though the protest lacked force. "I will not be commanded like a servant in my own home." Blackthorn did not raise his voice. "You will," he replied, "if you wish to remain a man of standing in any home at all." The implication settled heavily. Reputation, title, position, all of it now balanced on a single moment. Edwin's gaze flicked toward Holly. For the first time, not dismissive, not irritated, but uncertain, because she was no longer the silent woman who absorbed his anger and carried his shame. She stood differently now, still pale, still fragile in appearance, but no longer yielding. Holly felt it too. The shift, the quiet, unfamiliar strength settling beneath her ribs. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. She did not step forward, did not demand, did not accuse further. She simply waited. And that was power he did not understand. The silence stretched, then broke. Edwin inhaled sharply, as though swallowing something bitter. "This has gone too far," he muttered. "Yes," Blackthorn agreed. "It has." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, slowly, Edwin stepped forward. Not toward the Duke. Toward her. The movement alone seemed to fracture the last illusion of control he had clung to. Holly did not retreat. Her heart pounded, but her feet remained still. He stopped before her, close enough that once she would have lowered her gaze. She did not. His eyes met hers, and faltered. He hesitated, the word catching awkwardly. "You will not misunderstand this." Holly said nothing. She would not make this easier for him. Not anymore. His jaw tightened. Then, with visible effort, "I regret my conduct." The apology was incomplete, careful, still wrapped in pride. Blackthorn did not move, but his presence filled the room like an unspoken command. Not enough. Edwin felt it. Of course he did. His shoulders stiffened. His breath came shallow. And then, something broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. "I was wrong." The words fell heavy and unfamiliar. Holly's chest tightened, not with relief, not yet, but with the weight of something she had never expected to hear. Edwin's gaze dropped for the briefest second. Then, forcing the final humiliation through clenched pride, "I ask your forgiveness." Silence followed. Deep, unavoidable. Holly looked at him, at the man who had once held absolute power over her world, and saw not a monster, not a husband, but a man stripped of the protection his silence had given him. Small, human, accountable. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I do not know if I can give that." The truth settled gently between them. Not cruel, not vindictive, simply honest. Edwin closed his eyes briefly, as though the answer had been expected, as though it stung nonetheless. Then he stepped back, not in anger, not in command, but in something closer to defeat. Blackthorn moved then, not toward Edwin, but toward Holly, stopping at a respectful distance. "You will not remain here," he said quietly. Not a question, a decision. Holly's breath caught. The house around her, the walls, the corridors, the rooms that had witnessed everything suddenly felt distant, unreal. "You would take me away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would offer you the choice," he replied. Choice. Again. Freely given. No expectation. No demand. Holly looked once more at Edwin, then at the room, then at the Duke, at the man who had not turned away, who had not dismissed, who had not allowed silence to continue where it should never have existed, and slowly she nodded. Yes. The word was soft, but it carried something far greater than sound. It carried an ending, and the fragile beginning of something else. Blackthorn inclined his head slightly, not triumphant, not possessive, simply certain. "Then you will come with me." Outside, the light had strengthened. The clouds had begun to part, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Holly stepped forward without fear of what waited beyond the door. Behind her, a past left without silence. Before her, a future not yet defined, but finally, her own.